Now, moving on to our third panel session, going about the topic Face Off, why Malaysia or Singapore to build your companies. Now, this is potentially a fiery discussion and will be moderated by Mr. Chuang, Managing Director of KHC Ventures Sendirian Berhad and Do More Malaysia. Now, he will introduce our speakers for the session. Over to you, Chuang.
Thanks, Brian. Well, I guess without any further ado, Patrick Grove and Joel Neoh, being two of Malaysia's most preeminent digital entrepreneurs, really need no introduction, but suffice to say that Patrick has listed at least 4 to 5 internet companies in his 20-year internet career, and Joel has begun a whole raft of companies in the e-commerce and retail space, including Groupon, of course, and Fave as well in recent times. I'd like to take this discussion in 3 parts, actually. And the first part is really the chunkiest, where I get to get into the heads of all 2 entrepreneurs by examining the different life cycles of the internet business, okay? And the first one would really focus on the startup element, where there's things like cost structures and utility costs and availability of capital and things like availability of good human capital. The second part of the life cycle will really focus on the institutionalization of the business, where there's things like policy clarity, institutional frameworks. I would call it the maturation of the internet business. And the third part is really where each of these ventures will really look into getting to the international space, whether it's into ASEAN, specifically more than 3 or 4 countries, or whether it's into the global marketplace where you're starting to play in the big markets like China, India, and even America. So of course, then we talk about later on latterly the evolving environments from a policy perspective. And then I guess to get personal to end with, where we get both of them to give us a very honest look back as to whether they would have done things any differently if they had started the business now, and really what's in store for them for the next 3, 5, 7, and 9 years and going forward. So maybe I'll put the first question to Patrick, because obviously you've been around a little bit longer than Joel, Patrick. You've done a whole bunch of businesses, right? The Catch-Up Group started in 1999, and currently you're involved and you're back in properties and you're back in retail and the media as well. Where does Malaysia and Singapore sit in terms of really, if you are starting out in the internet space, which of these 2 jurisdictions offers the best proposition?
Yeah, look, hey everyone, I'm happy to be here, and I don't know whether I should be complimented or insulted when you say that I'm a little bit older than Joel, but look, that's fine. Look, I think it really, like I don't see it as black or white or right or wrong, right? Like so many people seem to just look at it that way, and I think it really, really depends on so many things. And one of the great things that you see with internet companies that everywhere in the world, there are great internet companies, right? Like no one particular part of the world has a pure dominance on the world. Yes, Silicon Valley, yes, China have a lot of great internet companies, but look, there are great internet companies found in every part of the world, and particularly Malaysia and so Singapore. So I think for us, when we looked at, the companies that we had started in Malaysia, such as iProperty or a company like iCar, which would be known as Carlist.my in Malaysia, there's a number of reasons why we found Malaysia a favorable environment. So, and I'll go through kind of 6 key points that were important for us. Number 1 was that English is a very commonly spoken language. And I know it sounds like a silly thing to say, but if you're trying to build a business in Thailand, and we've seen this, that it's not easy to hire people who speak fluent English. If you're building your business out of Hong Kong, most people speak Cantonese. You're building a business out of Indonesia, most people speak Indonesian as their primary language. So it's hard to build a regional management team where everybody speaks English as their first language. So number 1, in Malaysia, you can get that. English is widely spoken and is the primary language for most people. Number 2, it is a low-cost hub. Malaysia is I guess often said it's one of those great, it's like a first world country, but at a third world price point. So like even when you just look at office space from a rental point of view, like any office space in Malaysia is going to be cheaper than most other Southeast Asian countries. So it is a low-cost area. Number 3, it's actually a great regional hub. There's a lot of businesses that have been successful regionally that have used Malaysia as a hub. It's easy to get to Manila. It's easy to get to Thailand. It's easy to get to Jakarta. And AirAsia is proof of that, right? They've built a regional business out of Malaysia. So number three, there's a lot of people who've built regional businesses out of Malaysia. Number four, and I think this is very important to us, is that when we built our internet businesses, we were very keen on targeting the emerging markets, right? So for us, markets that are important are Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, from a customer perspective, right? Because we were focused on targeting emerging markets. So when you think about building a company in emerging markets, I often tell people that you need to be in the country that is as close to the emerging market as possible, right? And so when you look at Malaysia, right, it is probably a lot closer to Indonesia than, say, something like Singapore. Singapore is an amazing global first world city. And I feel that if you're building a business targeting Indonesian consumers, it's sometimes difficult to do that from Singapore, right? Whereas if you do that from Malaysia, I feel like you're closer to your customer cohort. Number five, and this was key for us, particularly with iProperty, is that most internet businesses target the middle class, right? You're targeting middle class millennials. That is the primary cohort of a lot of the internet companies that you see. And if you look at the middle class, the size of the middle class in Malaysia, it is actually very sizable. It is bigger than the middle class in Singapore. It might even be bigger than the middle class in some of the other emerging markets. So you actually have this sizable market of 20 million people that, whether your product is a property portal or a car portal or Fave or Groupon, that you've got this base of 20 million people who are going to be your early adopters and your first set of customers. And I think that's, those are sort of the key reasons why we always felt that Malaysia had really great reasons as to why you should base your internet company there.
Okay, well, I think I counted five. You did mention six, so I'm not sure whether you
I realized as I read my notes that point 6 and point 2 were the same. So you're right. I did say 6, and I only explained 5.
Not asleep yet. So Joel, obviously home ground advantage, you're Malaysian as well, and I mean you are one of the poster boys of the last 5 to 10 years in terms of the whole e-commerce retail space. What are your views in terms of both jurisdictions?
Yeah, so perhaps I think to add some context. So obviously Patrick has has been kind of the poster boy actually. So I remember when I first started my first internet company with Kylie, we were just looking in envy, right, to what Patrick was doing, in Malaysia, and Singapore, and in the region. So the entry point for me was really, I call it like the Internet 2.0 phase, right? So if you kind of take a look back, how all these digital opportunities came about, it started off with the telco industry, right? Building the infrastructure so that people could be connected, right? So as soon as I think, like people are able to connect, then there's a layer 1, right, of Internet 1.0 companies, in which, they are typically like horizontal platforms, classifieds, and certain like basic e-commerce platforms, right? So myself, I came in that 2.0 phase, in which, like horizontal e-commerce started. We started to kind of, figure ways on how we can actually disrupt digital media, try to figure ways to innovate, right, on top of what the 1.0 platforms have already done. And now I guess like, we're entering into this 3.0, right, kind of phase where, there's sort of video, social, you've got online, offline, hybrid, digital payments. So, and that's kind of the phase that we're going to experience over the next 5 to 10 years. I think in terms of choice point of selecting the countries, I think that has also evolved over the past 5, 10 years. So when I first started, there was actually no option, right? Because, being Malaysian, I was in Malaysia, there was very little money that I had to start a company. So typically, any entrepreneur would start in their local home ground, with the money that they've saved, and typically try to build a profitable business for, over 2 to 3 years, and to try to find the right product market fit, right? So in fact, in the first 2, 3 years, meeting investors, raising funds, very difficult, very intimidated by it, don't know what, how to go about it. And we managed to kind of pull through that phase. I guess after, those early phases of building a company, you start to realize that when you start raising funds from venture capital, or seed funds, there are actually multiple options, right? In terms of locations. So generally, actually, in the past 5 years, Indonesia has actually become one of the like key areas, right, where funds are kind of being raised for local companies. And Singapore is typically the place where regional companies or startups want to go regional, they kind of fundraise. So Malaysia is actually kind of, it's a good country, but it's kind of probably third or fourth, right? In terms of preference, of setting up a regional company or focusing on the local market because, we've got a decent population of 30 million, not as large as Indonesia, which is 200 plus million. And neither are we, generally where all the VCs and all the money is kind of collected. So right now, like Malaysia is typically, like for us, it's an operational HQ for a lot of companies as well. But the biggest local market is actually Indonesia and regional fundraising or HQ in Singapore.
Yeah, so I hate to get a little bit controversial this early in the discussion, but it just seems as if Malaysia is a great kind of like a breeding ground and a great cultural hotpot for starting a business, and I'm sure both of you are quite aware of that. But then it seems as if quite early on in the life cycle of the business, Singapore gets its claws into Malaysian companies and then attracts them, or rather attracts us to go over there to set up kind of like administrative or rather corporate headquarter type operations, where you've got great tax breaks, you've got great living conditions, you've got great access to funding. And maybe I'll ask Patrick this as well, because you may have listed your companies, Patrick, in Australia and in Malaysia, but you have not listed them in Malaysia. But why is it that Singapore seems as if to be better in terms of attracting reasonably mature Malaysian internet businesses to go over there, and we seem to be losing out in that respect?
I mean, it is a good question. I mean, I guess it's different for different entrepreneurs and as to what they want to do. But I mean, I think if you think about most entrepreneurs who are building a global or a regional business, I mean, they're going to have operations in Singapore, in Malaysia, and Indonesia, and Philippines, and Thailand, right? So, I mean, for instance, I have operations in Singapore. Joel has operations in Singapore. So, I mean, there's no world where you're only in Malaysia or only in Indonesia, right? We all aspire to build regional businesses. So we're going to be in many territories. And I think at the end of the day, one of the great things about being an entrepreneur and when you're building a regional or global business, you work with different countries to their strengths, right? So if a certain country has an abundance of programmers, you're going to build a programming team there. I'm sure if you talk to every regional business in Southeast Asia, they have programming teams either in India or Philippines or China, right? And that's just what it is, because that's where there's an abundance of talent, right? And so if we're saying that Singapore is great for administrative functions, finance functions, fundraising, then it makes sense to do that. But I think, we kind of look at it differently for us in terms of, where do we base our senior leadership? And then once you decide where to base your senior leadership, and then they will decide where to base their teams. And I mean, COVID's changed everything now. People are based virtually, but in a pre-COVID world, right, we very often wanted to base our people, our leadership closest to the customer, right? Closest to the country where we have the most customers or the most revenue. So when we were building iProperty, we were in every Southeast Asian market and we were in Hong Kong as well. But Malaysia was number one for revenue, number one for profit, and as a result, number one for staff. And so that's where we based that business. We may have had the administrations and the finance done out of another country, but at the end of the day, I've always believed that wherever you're going to find your biggest cohort of customers and revenue, you need to be as close to them as possible. And back to my earlier point, because Malaysia has a big middle class, which is what most internet companies target, then these are more and more reasons to be closer to Malaysia.
Yeah, I take what you said on board, Patrick. Access to customers and being close to your customers is primary, but at the end of the day, it's the headquarters of incorporation where you're in a way your holding company is incorporated and based. And in some cases, I want to cite the easy example being Grab, which has in many ways been attracted to Singapore and not been holding company in Malaysia. Singapore seems to be doing a much better job in terms of really taking some of our more mature businesses and getting them there. But Joel, is this something that you've also experienced in terms of where you are with Fave now?
Yeah, so maybe I'll kind of start off with one of the reports I just kind of looked at a couple of days ago, right? So statistically, more than half of internet companies have their HQ in Singapore, right? It's kind of slightly above 50%. And then 20% is actually in Indonesia. And then Malaysia is actually third, is actually about 10%, and then followed by like Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, and so on and so forth, right? So and there's so I guess generally as a Malaysian, so for example, Fave today, 70% of our headcount is actually in Malaysia. Our key leadership teams, our operational HQ is here. However, whenever we talk about fundraising, right, for this region, I would say like 80-90% of all venture capital funding decision makers are sitting in Singapore. So I think they've over the past 5-10 years have done a great job in terms of setting up the ecosystem there, to attract investors and decision makers to be there. I think that's one. And second area, it's actually the infrastructure of corporate secretary, legal, and I think they've also done a pretty good job there to make it conducive, right, for global investors to somewhat be comfortable with the processes and and also the setup, right, of companies there. So I guess when I think about it broadly is that, as what Patrick highlighted, we are always thinking about how we set ourselves up to advantages to the company and being close to the customer. And oftentimes the term customer really depends, right? Because to some extent, companies like ours, we will need to fundraise, and our customers in that aspect is actually investors, right? And that's where Singapore plays an important role. Whereas, in terms of the platform customers, then it will be we have actually operational officers in every market.
Yeah, so I think that's the policy conundrum facing the Malaysian government, because we don't seem to be offering the kind of policy framework and the institutional framework to hold on to our best companies. You just mentioned, right, and it's quite a truism to say this, that Singapore really is the magnet for being headquartered and to have the access to the global fund managers, right? What advice would you give the current government if you were asked in terms of reforming the current structure to enable our best companies to stay on in Malaysia and to grow from here? Patrick?
Well, good question. I'm trying to, it's funny. Like I've learned over the last 20 years, like as an entrepreneur, like you just build a great business. Like you learn not to rely on government. You learn not to rely on VCs, right? And you learn to prepare for the worst, and then you give it everything you got, right? So I mean, in terms of what could government do, I mean, yes, the government could provide more funding, right? Because it's a pain in the ass to try to raise funding all the time. Yes, the government could make it easier for people to fly in and out. Like, I mean, who knows? I mean, the government already does all these things, but at the end of the day, I look at it as a great entrepreneur is not going to rely on government to help build a great business. Like, you're just going to get out there and build your business. So in terms of when you're out there, like, I don't look for anything from the government. I just get out there and build my business.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm on your website, the Catcher Group website, Patrick, and I see that one of your 10 predictions in the next few years will be the fact that decacorns, obviously companies with valuations of $10 billion or more, will come from Southeast Asia, right? Whether or not they are formed in Malaysia and started in Malaysia is a point of debate. But whether or not they're grown from Malaysia or grown from Singapore or even Jakarta, as you say, or even Bangkok, will be open to moot. Joel, I mean, you guys could be the next decacorn. Who knows, right? What kind of like policy suggestions would you offer the Malaysian government if they asked you? And I'm not sure whether they are. Maybe they have asked you, right? Well, what kind of policy considerations might they put in terms of discussing it?
Yeah, I agree, Patrick. I think it really starts with the entrepreneur and the quality of the business. So, kind of putting aside the government first, just talking about, I guess to some extent, venture capital funding or, technology investments, it's quite a meritocracy, right? Because, you have like really smart people that are evaluating businesses. And if they see a good, entrepreneur and a good business model, technically the tendency of the funds will flow towards the company. So when I think about Malaysian companies, really the challenge of Malaysian startups is that they only focus on Malaysia, right? And I think that's actually a problem because investors who are making decisions across this region typically do not favor investing in a startup that only focuses on the Malaysia market. So in contrast, like for Patrick, when he starts his business, he's probably thinking regional from day one, right? He's not thinking of just serving one single market, and therefore kind of build or structure the business in a certain way and building the right leaders that has that global experience that's able or regional experience to take it to the next level. So yes, I think it starts with the Malaysian entrepreneurs kind of thinking about how they scale their business across the region. I think that's the kind of one aspect. And secondly is that whenever it comes to like fundraising, it really is. I mean, as much as we would like to have more investors in Malaysia, right, kind of investing in companies that are based here, but you've got to go out there, right, to the markets where the investors are already there, which is Singapore and Hong Kong. And you have to meet 50, 100 investors. Eventually, that's kind of the more doors you knock, the more you kind of learn, and more failure you get. So hopefully one day you're able to successfully fundraise. So I think governments. I'm not sure, right? As an entrepreneur, I have similar views to Patrick, which is, we don't rely too much on the government, but whatever benefits that we get, we are very blessed, and we're very happy for that.
Well, I mean, like it or not, we do have to rely on the government because they touch life in so many ways. And I mean, at the end of the day, Malaysia and Singapore are both very, very authoritarian governments where they do have their claws and they do affect society in so many ways. Whether it's in terms of discretionary income, or whether it's in terms of the income tax or corporate tax that we pay. Joel, I want to stay with you for a little while, because when I looked at your Fave website, right, a lot of your commerce and merchant partners are, in fact, I mean, they're centered in Malaysia, right? And you've got a smaller footprint in Indonesia, and I guess Singapore, being the smallest jurisdiction, has the smallest footprint. From an operational standpoint, right? And for the next, say, even 3 to 6 months, because we're all affected by COVID, right? What are the things that are in your mind right now in terms of dealing with the virus and in terms of just managing the business? And I'm not sure whether you're in survival mode or you're in growth mode, but what are the operational things filling your consciousness right now?
Yeah. So actually, our footprint is a little unusual for a company that is in 3 markets. Actually, Singapore is our largest market. We have the largest footprint, largest customer and merchant density there. Which is quite contrary to what we initially thought, because we thought Indonesia would be our largest market, followed by Malaysia, Singapore. It's actually in reverse. One of the biggest tailwind for us is actually the adoption of cashless or digital payments, especially in the offline world. So because of COVID, it was an accelerator to the demise of cash, where markets like Singapore, governments, and like merchant communities or restaurant communities have opted to reduce the usage of cash and kind of go fully cashless or majority cashless for safety and reasons. So we have been a big beneficiary of that. We were in a bit of a challenging period in April to June, when there were a lot of lockdowns across all 3 markets. But since then, we are back to growth mode actually. So year on year, we're actually growing. And we're close to profitability because of the tailwind, right, of the pandemic. However, I think one of our big concerns here is that while cashless proportion has grown, when we look at the data for restaurants, retailers, in Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, their business is still not back to 100%. In Singapore, it's probably back to only 80%. Malaysia, on average, most businesses are only operating at 50% of what they used to do. So I think we're more concerned about the overall sustainability of this industry, right? The retail industry, which is actually very heavily impacted by governments deciding whether there's lockdown or not, right? Which is heavily influenced by the Ministry of Health in every country. So we are generally in a good position, but we are actually quite concerned about overall the landscape and the industry that we serve.
Yeah, I mean, Patrick, the pandemic hasn't spared anybody, right? And I mean, you've always liked the media business, you've always liked the property business, you've always liked, the advertising businesses, and of course, you are also in terms of having your event business with World Digital. All these businesses have been pretty much affected, at least in part, by the pandemic. Again, same question to Joel, Patrick. How has the last 3 to 6 months really affected you in terms of your operations? And has it affected your strategic thinking when considering how to juggle your businesses from a cost standpoint and from a growth standpoint between Malaysia and Singapore?
Yeah, I mean, what's been fascinating is that it's amazing how much work you can get done when you're not in the office. So, in the background, that's my office. I haven't seen my office since March. Right? I haven't seen my office, and I haven't seen any of my team members or partners since March. Like physically, I've seen them virtually, right? But so it's pretty surreal. So it makes you start to realize, like, this concept of being based somewhere. You start to realize what does it really mean? Because if I think about, in the last 9 months, I have been virtually away from the office. Yet, some of our businesses are doing really well, and some of our other businesses are not doing really well, and it's just a function of COVID. But those are doing really well. It didn't matter whether I was there or not. So it's starting to make me think whether next year, could I reorient my life so I live in country 1 for 2 months, country 2 for the next 2 months, country 3, and basically just move around. And you start to wonder as well. And then when you think about yourself and then your other partners, do you all need to be in the same country? So I don't know. It's making me really think about what is the ideal and optimum way to structure a leadership team, and whether you need to all be in the same place.
Well, this question is just popped in from one of the audience members asking both of you, how can Singapore and Malaysia collaborate better to be the go-to countries in ASEAN for investors? And this is something which hasn't really, at least from the surface, appealed to both governments, because we've got this thing called ASEAN, we've got this thing called the AEC, the ASEAN Economic Community, and we've got APEC as well to try and stitch everything together. But there doesn't seem to be there seems to be much more competition between Malaysia and Singapore than there is in terms of teamwork and collaboration. Again, I don't know how much discussions you have with the powers that be, and in fact, we could literally have a third government in Malaysia within the next 6 months. But is there a proposition for both countries to be collaborating to keep and maintain our companies rather than competing for them? Maybe Joel?
I think fundamentally, as an entrepreneur, both countries have very different strengths. So for us, the way we operate is, anything that's got to do with like fundraising, investors. We're very much in Singapore, face to face with investors. But of course, as what Patrick has highlighted, COVID really kind of makes us reflect, right? Whether we actually need to oftentimes even meet investors face to face, where because we closed our last round completely virtual. Right, with our new investors on Zoom and on document sharing, tools, and we didn't meet from the start to the end of the process. But Singapore still holds oftentimes a good place for us to kind of fundraise and do strategic partnerships. Whereas Malaysia has always been an awesome operational HQ for us, where cost of talent and access to talent has been great, right? So I'm not sure how two governments could collaborate to accelerate that value proposition, but maybe Patrick can add. Yes.
Yeah, do you know what? I love this question. It's the best question I've heard in a long time. And I mean, let me go back to my vision. My vision is not, for the broader ecosystem, my vision is not that Malaysia builds a decacorn. My vision is not that Singapore builds a decacorn. I kind of see it all the same. Right, and my vision really is that an entrepreneur from Southeast Asia, and I don't really care what country they're from, but someone from Southeast Asia builds a global product. Right, I want to be in Silicon Valley and someone is using an app, and I want to be able to get, hey, that app that comes from Southeast Asia. Or I want to be sitting in London and someone's using an app and then say, hey, that app is from Southeast Asia. Because right now, if you look at all the apps we use on our phone, right, they're either from China or they're either from America. And so I keep thinking, why can't someone in Southeast Asia, and I don't care where this person is from, whether it's Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, why can't they put Southeast Asia on the map? And that's what I would love to see for the Southeast Asian. So I never look about, Malaysia should be globally on the map, or Singapore should be global. I always look at it from a Southeast Asian perspective. And one of the things I think Grab and Anthony should get credit for, I know sometimes people are like, Grab has moved to Singapore. I don't know. Have they? But here's what I do know. Whenever I meet people internationally, and I meet people at the highest levels of finance or banking or entrepreneurship globally, they know that Grab started in Malaysia. They know that Anthony is a Malaysian. And these are things that like we should be really proud of. So anyway, the way that I look at it is I would love Singapore and Malaysia and find a way to work together, because back to kind of what Joel said and I said, they have certain strengths. There's no point Malaysia trying to steal Singapore's strengths and Singapore trying to steal Malaysian strengths. Right? Let's face it, every entrepreneur in Southeast Asia building a regional business has an office in Singapore, has an office in Malaysia. You're not going to find any entrepreneur that has an office in one or the other. So I think really each country needs to play to its strengths so that you have a more successful region. And if you have a more successful region, then you'll start to create internet companies and entrepreneurs that are not just building ASEAN businesses, you're building global businesses. I kind of hope that's where ASEAN gets to in the next 10 years. Like we sit there in the US and we're proud to say, hey, that app, that service that you use, that was from Southeast Asia.
Well, the thing is, the naked truth is that a lot of the biggest fund investors in the world will be looking at companies like yourselves and really salivating at the prospect of 613 million people in terms of a marketplace and a combined GDP of $2.5 trillion on an annual basis. But it's really the holding company structure, and I suspect this is why Grab is now based in Singapore, because from an institutional framework, from a shareholder protection framework, from a rule of law framework, from an IPO framework, they would be better protected if they were to be held and incorporated there. And that appears to be the naked truth, as well as the political stability of the jurisdiction over Malaysia. Is that an incorrect assumption, Joel?
Yeah, well, I don't think that's an incorrect assumption, but again, where, in fact, a lot of HQs that is in Singapore, one thing to note is not just Southeast Asian companies. There are a lot of Indian companies that have actually relocated, their kind of holding company into Singapore in the past couple of years. So what I like about what Patrick was talking about is that the world is actually global, right? It's not really about Malaysia versus Singapore, but it's how do you actually leverage the best, right, from every country to create, whether it's like global products or global platforms. So many of the largest Indian companies, their HQ today is in Singapore. So it's not really just a Southeast Asia or Malaysia versus Singapore debate, right? I think one more thing to add is that one of the things I find fascinating is when I meet Malaysian entrepreneurs that are actually building export-based products or platforms, right? So to some extent, where their main customer base is in the US, right, or UK, and their entire team is actually in, for example, in Malaysia. Their cost base is in ringgit, but they're actually monetizing, in US dollars or in pounds, right? I think those are the type of companies in which, I'd love to see more. As we go along,
there seems to be, for example, what you just mentioned, that seems to be quite common among manufacturing companies, like a rubber glove company. There are holding companies here in Malaysia. They're listed in Bursa, but they sell to the world. Top Glove, Supermax, etc. But let's take it from the standpoint of the investor, right, Patrick? You've listed 5 companies, right? You've listed a couple in Australia on the ASX, and you've listed a couple in Malaysia, right? And you've had a lot of face time with investors. What are the top 3 things they ask of you before they put their coin into your pocket?
Well, so unfortunately, it never goes into my pocket. It goes into the company's pocket. But
so that was a Freudian slip, by the way.
I've never had it. It's never been an issue as about where the company is based. It always comes down to like, what is the target market that you're chasing? Like, what is the size of the addressable market? And back to Joel's point earlier, I think if you come out and say, I'm only focusing on the Malaysian market, it is significantly harder to get funding than someone who says, I'm based in Malaysia, but I'm targeting all of Southeast Asia. That is always an easier proposition than someone who says, I'm going to be the best in Malaysia, and that's all I want to do. I find that a very hard proposition to raise funding. And so for us, it's never been about where you're based, where your HQ is. It's always been about what are you targeting and what are you focusing on. So when we built iProperty, we're building we were HQ'd in Malaysia. We're building a regional business. We were sizable in Indonesia. We were sizable in Hong Kong. And we were able to go to investors, look, we've got a big market that we're focusing on. When we built iCar, we're only in 3 countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand. And we decided to focus on the 3 countries in Southeast Asia that are the 3 biggest from an automotive point of view. And so I find investors, that's all they care about. They just want to know, where are the numbers and are you targeting those big numbers? And I think that's why you find a lot of Indonesian companies tend to get a lot of funding faster, because just by the fact, if they say, I'm only focusing on Indonesia, that is already 300 million people, right? Whereas if someone says, I'm only focusing on Malaysia, that's really only 30 million. I'm rounding up. There's only 30 million people. So I think, you've got to be regional from day one. You've got to have a big target market. And I think the investor then doesn't care where you actually live or where your team is based.
No, I think the distinction to be drawn is there are certain risks associated with where your company is held. I think the easiest example would be to cite Ant Financial, right? It was supposed to come out and just make a listing a few days ago. And because of what Jack Ma said in China, that rubbed up the authorities the wrong way, and they basically derailed the whole listing. If Jack Ma had decided to do his listing in New York or in NASDAQ, there's a high chance that that IPO would not have been derailed. So there is a real risk in terms of where a company is held, and really for the entrepreneur, right, and for his management team and his leadership team to be considering where to best base their holding company, right? These are the things that come into play, as with the institutional framework, as with the protection of the institutional investors that come into their fold. Maybe you can give me your point of view, Joel. You've just raised, right? What have they required of you in terms of requirements before they, for them to put their money into you?
Yeah, so I think, of course, is the evaluation of the business model, the size of market, as what Patrick has already highlighted. I think that kind of goes without a saying. But I think back to your point, which is where is the company located? Oftentimes, the global or regional investors that we speak to, frankly, they're just more comfortable with, Singapore's legal system, or company secretary support. So I think if Malaysia were to improve in one area, I think that would be the aspect, right? Because, it's kind of hard to maybe kind of compare vis-a-vis like Singapore versus Malaysia. Should we be better than Singapore? Or likewise, I'm not sure if that's the rat hole that we want to kind of go down, because I do agree with Patrick, right? Which is really not about, Singapore versus Malaysia. But if you do want to attract more fundraising, right, or FDI or investors kind of investing into Malaysian HQ companies, then this company secretaries, right, the kind of legal firms probably needs an upgrade, right? Because so, for example, today, if it's an operational, if the HQ is in Malaysia, all the documents, a very simple thing. Imagine if you have 10 investors and you need your investors to sign the document, you actually have to physically ship it out, right, to the 10 investors, and they got to kind of sign it on the paper, because in Malaysia, like digital signatures for shareholder agreement is not really accepted widely yet, for instance, right? But in Singapore, it's just kind of a click away. So I think these are like small things, like for example, even ESOP allocation. So for companies like ours, we will need to actually kind of create ESOP pools where we issue out employees certain stocks. So company secretaries in Singapore are very well versed, right? They've got the tools, they've got the platforms to actually enable that very easily. However, in Malaysia, actually, right now, it's a lot of it's like paper, right? And it's still kind of not fully digital. So I think that area probably also needs to, it's actually a gap, right? For investors, yeah.
Okay, this question from the floor, I think observing the fact that there's a lot more venture capital money choosing to invest in ASEAN, Southeast Asian startups. And of course, the reasons why are clear because of the size of the market. But at the same time, there's also a lot of Chinese or China-based capital looking for such investments in ASEAN. And maybe I'll pose this question to both of you, because Malaysia and China have got very good relations. Perhaps some say better relations with China than Singapore has, right? Would Chinese capital prefer the companies to be held in Malaysia rather than in Singapore? Or again, is that just an unfair assumption? Patrick?
I don't think Chinese companies care. I think they just focus on the addressable market. I mean, during COVID, we sold a company to Tencent. They didn't care. Last week, one of our companies received a takeover bid from a Chinese company. It never once came up where you based or any of that. It's really more about what countries are you targeting, how many users, what's your revenue potential. I think they just focus on the numbers. I don't think they focus on where you legally structured.
Okay, I'd like to go to this question very quickly as well, because they're asking one of the persons in the audience whether startups can scale up quickly in a region this diverse, right? And I guess better you than Joel in a way, Patrick, because you've got businesses all over the region. ASEAN is not a homogeneous area. It's not South Korea. It's not America. It is 13 odd countries with very different languages and cultures, right? How difficult has it been to scale? And I also want to say that iFlix has been a very tough proposition for you. And
yeah, I mean, completely.
Some might say that iFlix was a failure for you.
Yeah, I mean, completely, right? And look, Joel has scaled businesses all over the region as well. So I'm not the only one that can answer this question. But what I would say is that scaling a business across Southeast Asia is bloody hard work. Really, really hard work. You're right. Languages, cultures, laws, God knows how many overnight flights, God knows how, last year I spent more time sitting in airport lounges than actually sitting in my living room. And so, yes, it's very complicated and challenging, but that's why it's very rewarding, because most companies are not willing to do that work. Most corporate entities are not willing to build a business in 5 countries simultaneously, right? They take it slow and they take it steady. So when I look at property, which was property portals across Southeast Asia, we sold that business for 2.5 billion ringgit. The person that bought the company from us, they could have bought us, or they could have spent 2.5 billion ringgit coming into Indonesia, coming into Malaysia, coming into Singapore, coming into Thailand, and trying to take us on. And they concluded that they're better off to buy us than to take us on, because they realize that building a regional business is a lot of work, and it's really painful work. So my view is always that if you are the entrepreneur or the management or the company willing to do that work, then you are going to be rewarded for that, because most people are not willing to do that work. And if they are willing to do that work, most people don't do it well. So actually, I enjoy the fact that we live in a very complicated region of the world, because that means that local entrepreneurs like Joel and myself, we create value, because that's what we do, because we're willing to put in the work, we're willing to get on those late night flights, whereas a lot of people are not.
Joel, what's the secret sauce? And which countries are is the least difficult to expand into?
Yeah, so before I go into countries, I think if I take a step back, it's actually the business model. So maybe if I try to simplify it, there are 2 types of business model. One that requires a lot of capital, and one that maybe requires much less capital, right? So the ones that require a lot of capital would be like e-commerce, logistics, right? So that you need to actually deploy this capital to build the infrastructure, whether people, platforms, skill sets, right? Government relations, so on and so forth. Then there are also companies in which very little capital is required to grow, right? They are typically more like SaaS companies in which you build a good product. So think about it like WhatsApp, right? On the time they got acquired, there was only like 10, 15 people, right? In the company that was building this product that's kind of used by many people across the world. So if we kind of look at the first type of company, which is capital intensive, then naturally the next question is, if you require a lot of capital, are there investors that's actually backing this idea, right? And what is required? Because I think investors also do have a lot of influence on companies like this, in which they have a viewpoint, right? Of which markets is important, which markets, so on and so forth. So oftentimes I think what I find is even like myself, during the times when it's Groupon, we expanded to 48 countries because it was hand in hand with the investors. They wanted to see the growth in so many markets, right? We were in every continent because they and us equally felt that by putting this amount of money, we're going to build the best voucher infrastructure for local businesses to grow, right? However, that also comes with a risk, right? Because as you raise a lot of capital, you're diluting you get diluted, right? The ownership of the company, right, or decision making is now oftentimes not at the entrepreneur's hand, right? It kind of goes into a board in which the entrepreneur may not have full control, right, of the destiny of the company. So I think that's a risk. But of course, at the same time, if it's kind of well managed, you kind of grow into companies that has huge impact, right, across the region, across the world. So therefore, I think there's also now a counter argument in which entrepreneurs are now thinking about the second type of companies, in which raise less capital, profitable, scale it up, have good control of it, and do something that has that impact, but also has the level of controls that they want. So so that's my feedback.
No, John, I think you're right. I think that whole mindset about raising as much as possible to expand into as many markets as possible might be a thing of the past, right? Because now it's all about profitability and about cost management and about being prudent. And I've noticed, Patrick, you've just leaned back. So I'm not sure whether that's a sign of whether it's a sign of your disapproval of this new mindset. But just in terms of for the entrepreneur and where they sit in this current climate of COVID, right? Is that happening? Where there's a focus where there's a focus on cost management and prudence rather than valuations, big valuations, and fast expansion.
Yeah, completely. I mean, entrepreneurs always focus on valuation, but I mean, I think they're realizing that the ability to raise money just for the sake of chasing top line is getting harder and harder, right? You can raise money if you can prove that you've got clear line of sight in the bottom line. So I've seen pretty much every company that we've been involved in has cut costs, has very sadly cut people. But the interesting thing is you find out that you can still achieve same levels of revenue with less headcount. So yeah, every company that I'm involved in has definitely become more efficient and more optimized during COVID.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes to go. So I think maybe if we can get a bit more introspective and from each of you, maybe tell the audience whether you would have done things any different if you started your business today than say 20 years ago. And then what's going to fill your mind for the next, let's talk about the immediate 3 to 6 months, right? So let's start with Joel and then with Patrick. Joel, would you have done things any different if you had started today?
Yeah, so my view is that it's never perfect, right? I think building a business, there's a lot of ups and downs and a lot of mistakes, right? So when I look back, I think one of a key important area to make a decision is when do you fundraise, right? Because oftentimes there are two types of entrepreneurs. There's one who's like always fundraising, right? So any time and every time is a good time to fundraise. And then there's a second type of entrepreneurs, very prudent. They don't like diluting their equity. They kind of want to have a big control of it, and so I think the decision between either one oftentimes is getting kind of an ideal time to fundraise, right? When the product is good, when it's kind of at a point where we think it can scale, and then you fundraise selectively and prudently and kind of take that product to the next level by expanding it, right? So on and so forth. So for instance, one of the mistakes that we made is that we were kind of the first type of entrepreneur, which we were in the early stages, we were always fundraising, right? While our business model wasn't very solid, the first business model for Fave was actually a fitness platform for connecting people who want to go to gyms and studios. They can book it through our platform. So we didn't have very good unit economics. The churn of users was actually quite high, and we closed around right after that, right? Kind of building that product. So I think that was quite challenging because we had the new investors who expected us to scale up that platform. However, we needed to use that capital to pivot, right, the business into what Fave is today. So I think you could kind of argue to say that if we didn't fundraise, we would have probably have to kind of shut down or wind down the company. But but at the same time, I think this kind of picking the right time or building the right product at the right time, right, at the right cost is I think is quite important.
What about your thoughts for the next 3 to 6 months, just in terms of just getting out of this crap that we're in?
Well, yeah, I think it poses actually to some extent there's good opportunities, right, in this. Personally, I don't believe that this is going to last forever, right? I think at some point, we will, come out from this. So there's actually a lot of opportunities if you look at it. For example, the job market has completely changed, right? That's what Patrick highlighted earlier, like remote working and, so you have companies like Upwork, which is actually about, providing freelancers with jobs. You see a lot more of that, right? As people try to find, like freelance work or remote work. So for instance, like maybe that opportunity wasn't, a big one in this region, but it's going to be potentially a big one, right? And you can see it across every industry. Whether is it like property as well, right? So you have a lot more sellers over the next 1 year. So less demand, but more supply, right? So I think there's also another opportunity there to help, sellers to close the deal, right? There are a lot more car sellers as well, I guess, right? So people, there's almost surplus of people, wanting to sell the cars versus buying. So potentially that's another opportunity there, right? To kind of create the right platforms there.
Okay. I've been told we've got very little time left. Patrick, last word belongs to you.
Oh, wow. Okay. Look, my view is, look, no regrets, no lessons. It's just go out there and just keep trying. I mean, we've failed at so many things that we've done, but every time we failed, we learned more from it. So look, I wouldn't do anything differently. And I would just say anyone who's out there, just try, just keep trying, just make mistakes and learn from it, do things right and do more of that. And I think if you do that, and if everything will be fine in the end. Okay, thanks both of you for your time and your insights. It's really insightful and really honest points of view from both of you. Okay, back to you, Pravina and Brian.
Thank you very much, Joel, Patrick, and Chuang for an energizing discussion. Now, 2 points really struck me. One was what Patrick said, which is that entrepreneurs should focus on just building good businesses and don't care about what the government does. The second thing is actually that really Malaysia and Singapore should collaborate instead of competing in order to build a stronger ecosystem so that the companies can really go regional and grow global. Now, we will now be moving forward to our next session, which is entitled In Conversation, Economy Reinvented, Accelerating Digital Trade. So it will begin shortly. Please click Join Session.